The wind across the Kansas prairie in the early spring of 1882 did not blow so much as it scraped, an endless, abrasive force that stripped the loose topsoil from the earth and flung it against the weathered timber of the Calloway ranch house. It was a functional structure, built for shelter rather than comfort, sitting stark and lonely against a horizon that stretched out in every direction like a pale, bruised ocean. The house had stood for 10 years, and for 10 years it had been starved of everything that made a building worth standing in. It lacked warmth. It lacked care. It lacked the steady, civilizing rhythm of a woman's hand. Ada Merritt arrived on a Tuesday, stepping down from the buckboard wagon with a single canvas grip and a posture that refused to yield to the biting wind. She was 29 years old, a woman who had seen enough of the world to harbor no illusions about its softness. The notice posted at the Mercantile in Oakhurst had been brief, devoid of any desperate pleas or flowery promises. It asked only for a housekeeper, terms stated plainly in a heavy, uneven script. $4 a month. Room and board. No ceremony. It was exactly the sort of arrangement Ada required. She did not want a family to coddle, and she did not want a home to call her own. She wanted a wage, a roof, and the quiet dignity of hard, necessary work. She stood in the yard, the dust swirling around the hem of her dark wool skirt, and assessed the property. The outbuildings were sturdy. The corral fences were mended. The barn roof was tight against the weather. The cattle operation was clearly managed with a rigorous, unyielding discipline. But the house itself was a hollow shell, its windows filmed with grime, its porch steps sagging, its door hanging slightly off plumb on iron hinges that shrieked when the wind caught them. The foreman, Cole Calloway, stepped out onto the porch to meet her. He was a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape that surrounded them, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and frost. He wore canvas trousers stained with harness oil and a canvas coat that had faded to the color of dry winter grass. He did not smile. He did not offer a welcoming platitude. He merely looked at her, his eyes a pale, steady gray that seemed to take in the measure of her in one sweeping, silent glance. He carried her canvas grip inside and set it at the base of the narrow, uncarpeted stairs. "Room is at the top on the left," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sounded as though it had not been used for conversation in weeks. "Kitchen is in the back. Pantry is stocked. You find something you need that ain't there, you put it on a list for the Mercantile." Ada nodded, pulling the pins from her hat and setting it on a dusty side table. "And the $4? She asked, her voice calm and level. "Paid on the 1st of the month," he replied, his gaze dropping briefly to the floor before meeting hers again. "I'll leave it on the kitchen table." That was the entirety of their agreement. There was no handshake, no exchange of pleasantries, no inquiry into her past or his expectations. It was a transaction of labor for coin, simple and absolute. Ada began her work the next morning, before the sun had even broken the flat line of the eastern horizon. She started with the kitchen floor, a surface that had not seen lye soap or a stiff bristled brush since the men had built the place. She heated water on the massive iron stove, hauling bucket after heavy bucket from the cast iron pump in the yard. She felt the familiar drag of the handle against her palms, the steady ache settling into her shoulders. The water boiled, and she added the soap, watching it dissolve into a cloudy, caustic broth. She knelt on the hard planks. She scrubbed. She found the original grain of the pine boards buried beneath years of tracked-in mud, spilled bacon grease, and the careless indifference of men who lived only to work the cattle and sleep in exhaustion. It took her 3 days just to find the wood, and another 2 to make it shine. From the kitchen, she moved to the windows, washing away the gray film that filtered the Kansas sunlight. She stripped the beds, boiling the heavy canvas sheets in a copper wash tub over an open fire in the yard, stirring the heavy wet fabric with a long wooden paddle. She beat the dust from the rag rugs until her arms trembled. She cleared the cobwebs from the corners of the ceilings and polished the glass chimneys of the kerosene lamps until they gleamed. Cole Calloway watched her, though he tried to pretend he did not. He was a man of the outdoors, a man who understood the mechanics of a horse's stride, the tension of a stretched wire fence, the subtle shifts in the weather. He did not understand the quiet, methodical force of Ada Merritt. He would come in from the pastures at dusk, the smell of cattle and sweat clinging to him, and find the house altered. The air inside no longer smelled of stale smoke and damp wool. It smelled of lemon oil, baked bread, and clean linen. He found himself stepping more carefully when he crossed the threshold. He began knocking the mud from his boots against the porch railing with a thoroughness he had never bothered with before. He did not speak of these changes. He did not offer thanks. He merely observed the way she moved through his house, her spine straight, her hands always busy, her expression a mask of calm competence. A quiet rhythm established itself between them, a choreography of shared space and mutual avoidance. They ate their meals at the long wooden table in the kitchen, sitting at opposite ends, the silence stretching between them thick and heavy. The only sounds were the scrape of forks against tin plates, the clink of the coffee pot against a mug, and the ever-present howling of the wind outside. It was during the second month that Ada discovered the state of the ranch accounts. She had gone looking for a clean sheet of paper to write down a list of needed supplies and had opened the drawer of the heavy oak desk in the corner of the parlor. Inside, she found a chaotic jumble of receipts, bank drafts, and mercantile bills, all stuffed haphazardly into a leather satchel. There was a ledger book, but its pages were mostly blank, save for a few jagged, illegible numbers scrawled in pencil. Ada pulled the satchel out and set it on the desk. She smoothed the crumpled receipts. She organized the bills by date. She realized very quickly that while Cole Calloway was a master of the physical labor required to run a ranch, he was losing a silent, bleeding war with the mathematics of it. She bought a ruled copybook of her own the next time she rode into Oakhurst for supplies. She paid for it out of the small reserve of coin she had brought with her, a secret indulgence. That evening, after the supper dishes were washed and dried, she sat at the oak desk in the parlor, lit the lamp, and began to work. She tracked every expense. She calculated the cost of feed against the price of beef. She balanced the accounts with a precise, elegant hand, her pen scratching softly against the paper in the quiet room. Cole found her there near midnight. He had come down the stairs in his stocking feet, searching for a cup of water, and stopped in the doorway. He looked at the neatly stacked receipts, the open copybook, the steady glow of the lamp illuminating the sharp line of her jaw. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep and sudden suspicion. "I am balancing the ledger," she said, not looking up from her column of figures. "You were losing track of the grain shipments. The mercantile overcharged you for the last delivery by $3.40. I have noted it here so you can claim the credit." He walked slowly into the room and stood behind her, looking over her shoulder at the neat, orderly rows of numbers. He stared at them for a long time. The silence stretched, tight and fragile. "I didn't ask you to do that," he said finally. "No," she agreed, dipping her pen into the inkwell. "You asked me to keep the house. The accounts are in the house. Therefore, they fall under my purview." He did not argue. He simply stood there a moment longer, the warmth of his large frame radiating in the cool air of the parlor, before turning and walking back up the stairs. The next day, he left a small stack of bank correspondence on the corner of the desk. He did not say a word about it. It was through the bank correspondence that Ada discovered his secret. The letters arrived on the first of every month, formal demands and statements of interest from the bank in Wichita. Cole would bring them in from the post, his jaw set, a dark, frustrated shadow passing over his eyes. He would leave them on the desk, sealed, and retreat out into the yard, finding some piece of equipment to violently repair. Ada opened the first letter. She read the dense, legal language regarding a loan taken out against the spring herd. She read the terms, the interest rate, the required date of payment. She understood the mechanics of it perfectly. That evening, as they sat at opposite ends of the supper table, she brought the letter out and laid it beside her plate. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the grain of the wood. "I was reviewing the bank statement today," she said, her voice perfectly casual, as if discussing the weather or the price of flour. "It seems they are requesting a confirmation on the spring draft. The language is terribly convoluted. I had to read it aloud just to make sense of their phrasing." She proceeded to read the letter aloud, word for word, translating the legal jargon into plain, practical terms. She did not pause. She did not look up to gauge his reaction. She simply read the information, laid the paper down, and picked up her fork. Cole sat perfectly still at the other end of the table. He looked at her. He looked at the letter. He looked at his hands, calloused and thick-fingered, resting on the edge of the table. He realized exactly what she was doing. She knew he could not read the words. She knew the shame that burned in his gut every time he looked at a page of type. And she was offering him the information freely, wrapping it in a fiction of her own supposed confusion, sparing him the humiliation of asking for help. "I see," he said, his voice thick and tight. "You ought to write them back, then. Tell them the draft is secure. Tell them the herd is healthy." "I will draft the response tomorrow," she said, taking a bite of her stew. "I will leave it on the desk for your signature." "That will do," he said. It became their unspoken pact. The letters would arrive. Ada would open them. She would read them aloud at the supper table, always framing the act as a necessity for her own comprehension, always maintaining the careful illusion that he was merely listening to her work through a complex problem. She drafted the responses. She balanced the books. She managed the entire financial life of the Calloway Ranch, all under the guise of simple housekeeping. Months bled into one another. The harsh winds of spring gave way to the brutal, baking heat of the Kansas summer. The prairie grass turned brown and brittle. The air grew thick with dust and the relentless drone of cicadas. Through it all, Ada remained a steady, unshakable presence. She mended his shirts, her needle weaving strong, invisible stitches into the worn fabric. She kept the water buckets full. She kept the house cool and dark during the hottest parts of the day. And Cole watched her. He watched the way she pinned her hair up off her neck when she was working over the hot stove. He watched the way her hands moved, quick and sure, sorting dried beans or kneading dough. He watched the quiet strength in her shoulders as she hauled laundry from the line. He learned the rhythm of her days, the cadence of her steps on the floorboards, the exact, subtle shift in her expression when she was amused by something but refused to smile. He found himself looking for her when he rode into the yard. He found himself lingering on the porch before going inside, listening for the sound of her moving about the kitchen. He found himself wanting to speak to her, wanting to break the heavy silence that lay between them, but the words always caught in his throat, tangled in his own profound sense of inadequacy. He was a man of dirt and cattle. She was a woman of order and intellect. He did not know how to bridge the gap. So, he spoke through action. He noticed that the cast-iron pump handle chafed her hands, so he wrapped it in soft, supple harness leather, binding it tight with waxed thread. He noticed that the wind rattled the window in her bedroom, so he spent an hour on a Sunday afternoon carving a small wooden wedge to secure the sash. He noticed that she favored a particular kind of black tea from the Mercantile, so he began bringing a tin of it back every time he went into town, leaving it silently on the kitchen counter. Ada noticed these things. She ran her fingers over the smooth leather on the pump handle. She looked at the wooden wedge in her window frame. She brewed the black tea and drank it in the quiet hours of the morning, feeling a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest. She understood the language he was speaking. It was a language of utility, of provision, of quiet, observant care. But there was one thing she did not understand. 7 months had passed since she arrived at the Calloway ranch. 7 months of scrubbing, washing, cooking, and balancing the ledger. 7 months of reading his mail and drafting his replies. And in all that time, he had never paid her. The $4 a month they had agreed upon never appeared on the kitchen table. The 1st of May came and went. The 1st of June. The 1st of July. Nothing. Ada did not ask for it. She was a proud woman, and she refused to beg for what she had rightfully earned. She knew the ranch was solvent. She knew the spring herd had sold well. She had balanced the ledger herself. She knew exactly how much money was sitting in the bank in Wichita. He had the funds. He simply chose not to pay her. She spent hours turning the problem over in her mind as she worked. Was he dissatisfied with her labor? No, the house was immaculate, and the accounts were perfect. Was he forgetful? No, Cole Calloway did not forget anything that pertained to the operation of his life. Slowly, a realization began to form in the quiet spaces of her mind. It was a dangerous thought, a thought that made her heart beat a little faster against her ribs. She understood, without being told, without a single word being spoken, why he was withholding her wages. He believed that the unpaid debt was the only thing keeping her there. He believed that if he paid her, if he settled the account and made her a free woman with coin in her pocket, she would pack her canvas grip and leave. He was holding the money as a tether, binding her to the ranch, binding her to him, because he did not possess the words to ask her to stay. The thought was both infuriating and profoundly touching. It was a cowardly tactic, but it was born of a desperate, unspoken need. Ada knew she could not let it continue. A foundation built on withheld wages and silent manipulation was no foundation at all. She needed him to speak. She needed him to step out from behind his wall of silence and claim what he wanted, or she needed to leave. The catalyst arrived in the form of a letter from Wichita, addressed to Ada herself. It was from a wealthy merchant family she had briefly worked for years ago. They had heard she was in Kansas. They were offering her a position as head housekeeper in their large, modern home. The terms were stated plainly, with no ambiguity. $6 a month. A private room. A staff of 2 girls under her direction. Ada read the letter sitting at the kitchen table, the afternoon sun slanting through the clean windows. It was a genuine offer. It was a good offer. It was an escape from the dust, the wind, and the heavy, unresolved tension of the Calloway ranch. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the pocket of her apron. She made a decision. That evening, when Cole came in for supper, Ada did not serve the meal immediately. She stood by the stove, her hands folded in front of her, her spine perfectly straight. Cole stopped in the doorway, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. He looked at her, his pale gray eyes cautious, his heavy shoulders tensed. "I will be leaving on the Friday stage," she said. Her voice was calm, steady, betraying none of the turmoil churning in her stomach. Cole did not move. He did not blink. The silence in the kitchen became absolute, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantel. "I have received an offer of employment in Wichita," she continued, looking directly into his eyes, refusing to let him look away. "The terms are agreeable. $6 a month. It is a formal household." He stood there, the dust of the prairie clinging to his boots, his face a hard, unreadable mask. He swallowed, a slow, difficult movement in his throat. "I see," he said. The words sounded as though they had been dragged over broken glass. "I have prepared the ledger through the end of the month," she said, turning back to the stove to lift the heavy iron pot. "I have drafted responses to the pending correspondence. The house is in order." She served him his supper. She sat at her end of the table. They ate in a silence so thick it felt like physical pressure. He did not ask her to stay. He did not mention the unpaid wages. He simply ate his food, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the wood. The next 3 days were a torment of quiet efficiency. Ada packed her canvas grip. She scrubbed the floors one last time. She baked enough bread to last him a week. She polished the lamp chimneys until they hurt the eyes to look at them. Every action was a silent challenge, a demand that he speak, that he act, that he do something to stop her. He did nothing. He rode out earlier than usual and returned later. He avoided the house. He avoided her. He retreated into the safety of his physical labor, hiding from the emotional confrontation he was entirely unequipped to handle. Friday morning arrived gray and heavy, the wind carrying the sharp scent of an approaching storm. Ada dressed in her traveling clothes, a dark wool suit that was practical and severe. She pinned her hat firmly in place. She picked up her canvas grip. She walked through the house one last time. She looked at the clean floors, the ordered desk, the wood stove she had commanded for 7 months. She felt a sharp, bitter ache in her chest. She had genuinely hoped he would find the courage. But a man who could not speak his own heart was not a man she could build a life with, no matter how tenderly he wrapped a pump handle in leather. She walked out the front door, leaving it unlocked. She did not look back. The walk to the stage depot in Oakhurst was 2 miles. The wind pushed against her, whipping the dust into her face, tearing at the hem of her skirt. She walked with a steady, punishing stride, her grip heavy in her hand, her jaw set against the sting of the grit. The depot was a small, weathered building at the edge of town, consisting of a ticket window and a long wooden bench under a slanting tin roof. Ada purchased her ticket to Wichita. She walked out to the bench. She sat down, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She waited. The stage was not due for another hour. The town was quiet, the streets empty, save for a few stray dogs and a horse tied in front of the saloon. The sky overhead was bruised purple, threatening rain. Ada closed her eyes, listening to the wind rattle the tin roof. She told herself she had made the right choice. She told herself that practical women did not wait for silent men to find their voices. She told herself she was moving toward a better, more secure future. Then she heard it. The rhythmic driving thud of hooves on hard-packed dirt. She opened her eyes. Cole Calloway was riding down the main street of Oakhurst. He was not riding his usual slow, steady trot. He was riding hard, pushing his heavy roan gelding to a full gallop, the horse's chest lathered with sweat, its nostrils flared red. He pulled the horse up hard in front of the depot, the animal sliding in the dust, tossing its head. Cole threw himself out of the saddle before the horse had even fully stopped. He did not bother to tie the reins. He strode toward the wooden bench, his boots striking the boardwalk with a heavy, purposeful sound. He looked wild. His hair was blown back by the wind, his face streaked with dust and sweat. His chest heaved with exertion. He stopped directly in front of her, towering over her sitting form. Ada looked up at him. She did not speak. She was not going to make this easy for him. She was not going to offer a single word of encouragement. He had to cross this bridge himself. Cole reached into the deep pocket of his canvas coat. He pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He did not hand it to her. He set it down on the wooden bench beside her, the coins inside clinking with a dull, heavy sound. $28, he said, his voice raw, breathless, fighting the wind. Ada looked at the pouch. She looked back up at his face. 7 months at $4 a month, she stated, her voice perfectly level. The account is settled. The account is settled, he agreed, his chest still heaving. He took off his hat, crushing the brim in his large, dirt-stained hands. He looked at her, his pale gray eyes burning with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. I didn't pay you, he said, the words coming out in a rush, as if they had been dammed up inside him for months and were finally breaking free. I didn't pay you because I knew the day I put that money on the table was the day you would leave. I knew it. You don't need me. You don't need this town. You can balance a ledger and read a banknote and run a house better than any woman in Kansas. I didn't have anything to hold you with except a debt." He stopped, swallowing hard, struggling to organize his thoughts, struggling to find the words he had never learned to use. "It was a coward's way," he said, his voice dropping, rough with shame. "I know that. I'm not a man of letters, Ada. I can't read the words on a page without feeling like a fool. I can't spin a pretty sentence. I can only do the work. I can only build the fence and run the cattle and try to keep the roof tight." He took a step closer, casting a shadow over her, blocking the wind. "But I know what a house feels like when it's empty," he said softly. "And I know what it feels like when you're in it. You fixed the accounts. You fixed the windows. You fixed the whole damned place. But you didn't just fix the wood and the glass, Ada. You fixed the air. You made it so a man actually wants to come inside at the end of the day." Ada sat perfectly still, her hands gripped tightly together in her lap, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "You have your money now," Cole said, gesturing to the heavy pouch on the bench. "You are free and clear. You can get on that stage and go to Wichita and live in a fine house and earn $6 a month. You have every right to do it." He paused. He looked down at his boots, then forced his head up, meeting her gaze with a raw, terrifying vulnerability. "But I am asking you not to." A single drop of rain fell, hitting the dusty boardwalk with a sharp smack. "I am asking you to stay," Cole said, his voice dropping to a low, desperate rumble. "Not as a housekeeper. Not for $4 a month. I am asking you to stay as my wife. I want you to run the house because it's yours. I want you to balance the ledger because it's our money. I want to build a life with you, Ada. A real life. That's what I'm asking." He stood there, entirely exposed, having laid every piece of his pride and his fear on the wooden bench beside her. He waited for her judgment. Ada looked at him for a long, quiet moment. She saw the dust on his face, the sweat on his brow, the trembling of his large hands crushing his hat. She thought of the leather wrapped around the pump handle. She thought of the wooden wedge in her window. She thought of the quiet, steady strength of a man who would ride a horse into the ground just to admit he was a coward. She reached out and placed her hand over the heavy leather pouch on the bench. "You took a remarkably long time to figure this out, Cole Calloway," she said, her voice soft, carrying a hint of the dry amusement he had come to know so well. Cole let out a breath that sounded like a shudder. The tension drained out of his shoulders, leaving him looking exhausted but profoundly relieved. "I am a slow man, Ada. I have never claimed otherwise." "You are," she agreed, standing up from the bench, brushing the dust from her skirt. She picked up the heavy pouch of coins and dropped it into her canvas grip. She looked up at him, allowing a small, genuine smile to touch the corners of her mouth. "But you are also a thorough one, and I suppose that counts for something. Does it count for enough to let the stage pass?" he asked, his voice hesitant, hopeful. Ada reached down and picked up her canvas grip. She held it by the handle, feeling the weight of the $28 inside. "It counts for enough," she said. "Now, put your hat on before it rains, and take my bag. We have a ranch to run." Cole stared at her for a second, a slow, brilliant smile breaking across his weathered face, changing his entire countenance. He shoved his hat onto his head, reached out, and took the heavy canvas grip from her hand, carrying it as easily as if it weighed nothing at all. He offered her his arm. She took it, feeling the solid, unyielding muscle beneath the rough canvas coat. Together, they turned away from the depot, away from the impending arrival of the stage, and began the long walk back toward the Calloway ranch, the first heavy drops of a Kansas thunderstorm beginning to fall around them. They were married 3 weeks later, in a brief, unadorned ceremony in the parlor of the ranch house, standing in front of the heavy oak desk where Ada had first discovered his secret and where she had first begun to build their shared life. The town of Oakhurst attended, standing in the yard, eating the food Ada had prepared, celebrating the formal union of two people who had clearly belonged to one another for months. The years that followed were not easy, for the Kansas prairie does not offer ease to anyone. There were droughts that cracked the earth, blizzards that buried the fences, and cattle that died in the freezing wind. But the house stood firm against the weather. It was a home now, filled with warmth, order, and eventually, the sound of children's voices. 7 years later, in the late autumn of 1889, Ada sat on the front porch in a heavy rocking chair, wrapped in a woolen shawl. The sun was setting, casting a long, golden light across the prairie, turning the brown grass to copper. She held a ledger book in her lap, her pen scratching softly in the fading light. Cole came up the steps, his boots thudding softly on the wood. He was older now, gray touching the hair at his temples, the lines around his eyes cut deeper by the sun. He carried 2 mugs of steaming black tea. He handed one to her and sat down on the step near her feet, leaning back against the porch railing. He looked out at the horizon, taking a slow sip of the hot tea. He reached out and rested his large, calloused hand over her ankle, a quiet, steadying touch. "Bank draft goes out tomorrow," Ada said, not looking up from her columns of figures. "We'll have the spring loan paid off 3 months early." "You're a terrifying woman with a pencil, Ada," Cole said, his voice warm, laced with the easy, comfortable humor that had grown between them over the years. "Someone has to keep track of the money," she replied, closing the ledger and setting it on the small table beside her chair. "Especially since I still haven't been paid my wages for the last 7 years. Cole laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that echoed across the quiet yard. He turned his head and looked up at her, his pale gray eyes shining with an absolute, unshakable devotion. "I told you," he said, his thumb stroking the wool of her stocking. "I'm keeping you in debt. It's the only way I can guarantee you won't get on a stage to Wichita." Ada smiled, leaning back in her chair, watching the last sliver of the sun dip below the edge of the world. She rested her hand on his shoulder, feeling the solid, enduring strength of the man she had chosen. That is the profound truth of a quiet love. It does not announce itself with grand, theatrical gestures or poetic declarations. It does not need to shout to be heard. It is built in the spaces between words, in the steady rhythm of shared labor, in the silent, observant acts of care that say everything a heart is too afraid to speak. It is found in the leather wrapped around a pump handle, in the careful balancing of a ledger, and in the courage of a slow man who finally realizes that the only thing more terrifying than speaking his truth is the prospect of an empty house. Thank you for riding with me today. I am deeply grateful you were here to share this journey into the past, to witness the quiet resilience of a love built on the harsh, beautiful frontier. Until next time, keep riding,